The Jets will be making a major decision when they decide who to select in the top 10 of the NFL draft. Let's start unpacking the top options today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 21st, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, on today's show, we're going to turn our attention to the NFL draft. The Jets currently on the 7th overall pick in the upcoming selection process. And we're going to look at some of the options the Jets have with that 7th overall pick. And more specifically, we're going to look through some recent mock drafts. And mock drafts can be useful because they give you a sense of which players will be available for the Jets, and they give you a sense of what some of the options may be. So I'm going to go through 3 recent mock drafts, all of whom have the Jets selecting different players. Now I'm going to begin with a mock that Pro Football Focus did. And this was specifically a mock draft for the New York Jets. So they went through 7 rounds. We're just going to focus on the first round because today we are keyed in on who the Jets will select in the top 10. And they have Mason Graham of Michigan going to the Jets. And Mason Graham is a prospect, even at this early stage, who I have discussed a lot on this show. He is a defensive tackle prospect. I love the idea of the Jets picking Mason Graham, and I love it for a couple of reasons. First of all, defensive tackle is both an important spot and a spot where the Jets are relatively weak. And I use the word relatively for a reason. The reason I use that word is the Jets have a fantastic defensive tackle in Quinnen Williams. But once you get past Quinnen Williams, the group is pretty weak. In fact, heading into last season, I felt this way, and I continue to feel this way, that if Quinnen Williams were to get injured, the Jets suddenly may have the worst defensive tackle situation in the NFL. And I think part of the Jets' issue at defensive tackle over the last couple of years past Quinnen was actually like part of their strategy. I think the general viewpoint was that Quinnen Williams was so dominant that he was going to draw double teams, and he'd be able to beat those double teams. And the guy next to Quinnen Williams had a pretty easy job because he was going to be single blocked most of the time. So any like halfway decent defensive tackle next to Quinnen Williams was going to produce. And it worked well in 2022 with Sheldon Rankins, who had a very good season. It even worked in 2023. Quinton Jefferson, who very much a journeyman defensive tackle, a guy who's a decent pass rusher, but nothing special, put together the best season pass rushing of his career. However, 2024 showed us the limits of the strategy. Quinnen Williams did not have a great season by his standards. Now, I think by the standards of a lot of other defensive tackles, Quinnen Williams had a really good year. And the guys next to him, Javon Kinlaw was a failed signing. There's really no way around that. The Jets signed Kinlaw, and, Robert Saleh was excellent on the defensive line, but he had kind of a blind spot for guys he coached in San Francisco. Sometimes he loved the guys that he was with in San Francisco a little too much. Kinlaw was a disappointing first-round pick. Saleh's final year there. It felt like the Jets saw something that they believed they could unlock, and they could not. Lecky Fatu, who was signed from Arizona to be kind of the run stuffer, did not do a very good job. Solomon Thomas, talking about that Robert Saleh blind spot about guys he coached in San Francisco. Solomon Thomas was the first draft pick the 49ers made when Robert Saleh became their defensive coordinator in 2017. And it simply did not work out. Solomon Thomas was a good locker room guy. That first year, I think he helped implement the system. That was the year the Jets jumped. It was actually Saleh's second season, but the Jets jumped from one of the worst defenses in the league the year before to one of the best defenses. And some of the credit, not the bulk of the credit goes to the talent base overall being upgraded, but some of the credit goes to Saleh signing a couple of guys who knew the system, who could kind of help players who maybe struggle with it in year one pick it up in year two. But defensive tackle spot for the Jets after Quinnen Williams is shaky. And Mason Graham would be a heck of an addition because this is a guy, if you watch him on the film in college, he was absolutely dominant. And I love the idea of having two top-notch defensive tackles. I love the idea for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, Mason Graham with Quinn and Williams in the mix, he's going to see a lot of single teams because Quinn and Williams are going to be, you can only double one defensive tackle under the normal alignment because most of the time you're going to have five offensive linemen versus four defensive linemen. So 5 versus 4 means somebody can be double teamed, but only one. This is also potentially going to mean more one-on-one opportunities for Quinn and Williams because Mason Graham is an excellent prospect. He'll probably draw his share of double teams, which means Quinn and Williams will have an opportunity to improve his numbers. And as I discussed on a recent show, I also think that Quinn and Williams and Mason Graham are like at the perfect age for a duo because Quinn and Williams is really in the prime of his career right now. He knows what he's doing. He's been around the league for a long time. So first of all, in theory, I think he'd be a pretty good mentor for Mason Graham. And I know that, I've stated in the past that sometimes my view is that like the role of the veteran mentor is overstated, but I do think it's helpful, especially a player like Quinn and Williams, who wins on technique, who is so refined in his game. The opportunity to take a young guy under his wing and show him, this is how you approach your craft, not only in terms of making sure your conditioning's there, making sure your weight training's there, but also in terms of talking about scenarios, talking about if this is my number one move, and if this gets stalled, then I move to this move. You can teach him some of the finer points of getting after the quarterback. And beyond that, Quinn and Williams right now being in his prime, Mason Graham, who would be a rookie, you would hope that a top 10 pick would step in and be very good right away. But there is an adjustment moving from college to the NFL. Even for great prospects, Mason Graham is probably not going to be at his peak in year one. Quinn and Williams is in his peak right now. So Quinn and Williams can kind of be the top guy at the defensive tackle position for the Jets, whereas Mason Graham could kind of be the sidekick. Then as Quinn and Williams ages, and I do think Quinn and Williams is going to have a graceful aging curve because of the way he plays, because he's such a technician, because he relies on his pass rushing moves. Quinn and Williams. Look, Quinn and Williams is an excellent athlete himself. He went 3rd overall for a reason. You don't go number 3 overall if you aren't a tremendous athlete. But Quinn and Williams, I think, is going to age gracefully, and as he ages gracefully, Mason Graham will be entering his prime, and Mason Graham would eventually be able to slide into that top defensive tackle role, and Quinn and Williams would be able to slide into more of a sidekick type role. I think this could be an excellent duo. And talk about ways to build a defense. Look, there are lots of ways to build a good defense, but a way that I really like, and a way few teams, it's not that few teams want to do it, it's that few teams have the capability of doing it. Building it up the middle with two excellent defensive tackles, two guys who disrupt an offense, because when an offense is disrupted up the middle, it makes it really tough. You have a tough time running the ball because most of the runs do go up the middle, and pressure up the middle drives a quarterback crazy. If there's pressure off the edge, well, it's not good for the quarterback, but if there's no pressure up the middle, the quarterback can step up. If there's pressure up the middle, the quarterback either has to go left or right. And while there are the great quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes who still thrive, moving to their left and right, most quarterbacks really get thrown off if they have to move laterally like that. Quarterbacks are much more comfortable stepping up in the pocket if the interior line holds and the defensive tackles don't get pressure. You have two defensive tackles who can generate pressure. You're in for a world of hurt typically as an offense. So Mason Graham right now seems like a very logical pick if he's there for the Jets at 7. But it would not be the splashiest move. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to a mock draft, which would have the Jets potentially moving up for their new franchise quarterback. However, it's more realistic than a scenario that's been floated in the media the last couple of days. What is that scenario? Who would the Jets draft? We'll get into that as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, and even if you miss in the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You'll love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you'll never feel like you've missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're going through some mock drafts today, figuring out who the Jets' options may be when they pick with the 7th overall selection in the upcoming NFL draft. There was a notable mock draft put out by a writer, Gennaro Felice of NFL.com yesterday. So this mock draft actually has the Jets trading up. So the Jets don't stay at 7 in this mock. They actually move from 7 to 5. And the player they are drafting is a big name. It is Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback out of Colorado, who also happens to be the son of Colorado's head coach. Deion Sanders is not just Colorado's head coach. He's also one of the great players in NFL history, a Hall of Fame cornerback, a player many believe is one of the greatest, maybe the greatest cornerback to ever play, but somebody who was also a phenomenal playmaker as a returner and also played a little bit at wide receiver. Shedeur Sanders certainly would be a big move for the Jets. So in this mock draft, Cam Ward goes number 1 to Tennessee. Abdul Carter goes number 2 to Cleveland. Travis Hunter goes number 3 to the Giants. And Will Campbell goes number 4 to the New England Patriots. Jets trade up from 7 to 5 for Shedeur Sanders. This mock does not mention what the Jets would give up, but to me, this would be a more logical and a more likely situation than what we've heard, than the speculation we've heard the last couple of days in the media, because there's been some buzz about the Jets potentially moving up to number 1 for Cam Ward of Miami. And look, anything can happen. And we don't know how Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji rate these quarterbacks. It's entirely possible they have Cam Ward as like the best prospect of the decade. In that scenario, I guess it would be possible for the Jets to trade up from 1. To get up from 7 to 1 is going to cost an enormous package. And, I think when you evaluate these quarterbacks, you may really like a guy. You may say that this guy's an excellent quarterback, but there are very few quarterbacks who are going to be worth multiple first-round picks and maybe multiple second-round picks that would take to get up from 7 to 1. But if one of the two quarterbacks falls a little bit, one of the two quarterbacks, maybe gets into the range where you're at 5, that's where I think a trade up could be in the cards, because it's not going to cost nearly as much. Again, you on some level you're rating these players, and at some level there's a price that makes sense for every player, and there's a price where a player just doesn't make sense. I think if you're talking about moving all the way up to 1 right now, like, again, we don't know what the Jets are going to do. I mean, I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility. There's nothing that's impossible, especially with the New York Jets. But we're talking a huge price. And to justify that, I mean, you'd have to view this guy as like having a good shot of being the next Patrick Mahomes. If you're only moving up from 7 to 5, the price is not going to be nearly as high. And look, this would be a very flashy move because, first of all, you're going out and you're getting your quarterback. Another new quarterback, but you're not just getting any quarterback. You're getting the son of one of the flashiest players of all time, Deion Sanders. And there is some there is a school of thought out there that Deion will only want his son to go to a stable organization. And there have been some talk. Would Deion be okay with his son going to Cleveland? Would Deion be okay with his son going to the Jets? Because the Jets obviously have not been a model of stability through over the last decade and a half. And like the last time I remember us really having an issue with, is a player going to go somewhere, it was Eli Manning in 2004 when he refused to go to the Chargers. It always depends on how far a player wants to take things. Eli Manning essentially said, "Don't draft." He told the Chargers, "Don't draft me, and I won't report." Chargers ended up drafting him, and within an hour or so, Eli was traded to the Giants for Phillip Rivers. Giants drafted Phillip Rivers. They sent Rivers and a bunch of picks to San Diego, to the Chargers. Eli Manning came to the Giants, and the rest was history. I can't really remember another situation like that in recent memory. So the Jets would certainly need to have assurances that Shedeur Sanders would be willing to come to the team. But it certainly would be an interesting move. And I've expressed grave reservations about the Jets drafting a quarterback this year. But I will say part of that is I think the Jets would either need to, mortgage the future to move up to the top 2 picks, or they would need to draft somebody outside of the Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders class. You'd be talking about drafting Jalen Milroe, 7th overall. And while I think Jalen Milroe could be a very good pro, he's not the type of guy who is good enough or is sure enough thing that I would feel comfortable drafting him at 7. If we get to a range where Shedeur Sanders falls, and this is one of the reasons that I think these, following these mock drafts can be useful, because they take you through like all sorts of different scenarios, because there's so many different ways the first round can play out. And there is really a butterfly effect in these things. The player one team takes, if it's a surprise, can change everything about the draft. And if Shedeur Sanders gets to 5, I mean, he is a guy with tools to be a very good quarterback in this league. If the Jets were able to pay a reasonable price to move up to 5, that is like maybe one of the scenarios where I could get behind the Jets drafting a quarterback this year. Because, look, we know the quarterback situation is a question mark. And as we've discussed, there really are not a lot of great options. There's nobody out there that's going to be able to, on the pro personnel side, when we're talking about players the Jets could sign or the players the Jets could trade for, there's really nobody out there who's a long-term solution at the quarterback position. And, in this league, that's the goal. Now, you don't need to have a long-term quarterback at all times. Sometimes you can find a bridge guy who can get you through a few years. I do think there's a luxury in having a quality bridge quarterback who allows you to try and find the quarterback on your schedule. Allows you to try and find the long-term guy on your schedule, like Kansas City had with Alex Smith, or like Detroit has right now with Jared Goff. You don't want to be in a situation where you feel desperate to draft a quarterback. You want to be in a situation where the right quarterback, you can wait for the right quarterback to fall to you. Well, it's also convenient if the right quarterback falls to you right off the bat, in your first year. And I think that the number one task for Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji now and over the next couple of years is to secure that long-term quarterback. But you don't want to mortgage the future. I don't think you want to give up multiple first-round picks, multiple second-round picks to move all the way up to 1. And I think that there's a good chance that the Ward-Sanders duo goes 1, 2, or 2 of them go in, or they're 2 of the top 3 picks. But if you get into a scenario where one of the 2 guys falls, that's the scenario where I could actually see the Jets making a move for the quarterback. My reservations about the Jets drafting a quarterback this year notwithstanding. Now, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about another area where I have reservations with the Jets making a top 10 pick. And unlike a scenario where Shedeur Sanders falls to 5, I have an issue with the Jets drafting at this position in the top 10, period. There's really no scenario where I'd be comfortable with it, but we'll still go over it as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets pod. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're going over a couple of mock drafts today to try and figure out who the Jets' options will be when they pick 7th overall, or options to trade up, as we discussed in our last segment. We're going to close out today's show by looking at a mock draft from Dan Jeremiah of NFL Network. Now, I will say that Dan Jeremiah's mock drafts over the last couple of years for the Jets have been very notable because Jeremiah has a long history with Joe Douglas, the former Jets general manager. So there were frequently times where Jeremiah would make a pick in the mock draft and ended up being the player the Jets drafted because it felt like Jeremiah had a good sense of the Jets thinking, and whether that was because Joe Douglas was tight with him and giving him information, or whether Jeremiah and Joe Douglas Jeremiah just understood how Joe Douglas thought. We don't really know, but Jeremiah's views now, I think, with Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji in place, have less significance. Jeremiah has the Jets picking tight end Tyler Warren out of Penn State. And the way this draft goes, he actually has Abdul Carter out of Penn State going number 1 to Tennessee, Cam Ward, the quarterback, going to Cleveland at number 2, Travis Hunter, the two-way threat, going to the Giants at number 3, Will Campbell going to the Patriots at number 4, Mason Graham going to the Jaguars at number 5, and Shedeur Sanders falling to 6 to the Raiders. So this is another scenario where Shedeur Sanders falls, but in this case, the Jets don't jump the Raiders. Jets stay at 7, and they draft Tyler Warren out of Penn State. And I have to say that this is not a move I'd be a fan of. Now, you may remember last year, I was not a fan of the idea of the Jets drafting Brock Bowers, and really was not about whether Brock Bowers had the potential to be a good prospect. It was more about the position he played. And Brock Bowers ended up having, of course, an excellent rookie season, and clearly would have been worth the 10th overall pick if the Jets had the Jets drafted him. But let me start out by saying, look, if I was against the Jets drafting Brock Bowers, there's no way I'm going to be for the Jets drafting Tyler Warren, who is really an inferior prospect to Bowers in practically every way. And all of the positional concerns I have about Bowers apply. And it's not about the prospect himself, because it's a little bit about the prospect, because I don't think Tyler Warren's anywhere near as good of a prospect as Brock Bowers was. But even with Brock Bowers, I think that there's a concern in the NFL that the league does not do a great job at scouting the tight end position. And if you look through the years, the guys who are drafted high at the tight end position, there's a very high miss rate when we're talking about whether they're the true difference makers at the position. And at the tight end position, there aren't many difference makers. I mean, let me give you a little stat here. Last year at wide receiver, there were 21 players who had a 1,000-yard season. There were 3 tight ends. So for a tight end to be a great tight end to be as valuable as a great receiver, you've pretty much got to be a top 3 player. There are 21 guys at the wide receiver position who produced what 3 guys produced at the tight end position last year in the NFL. And history shows us that the league just doesn't do a great job at picking out who the great tight ends are going to be, because most of the great tight ends don't go in the first round. Bowers was an exception. And look, this speaks to a simple fact, is that to justify the pick, Tyler Warren would have to be Brock Bowers. There's no Garrett Wilson did not have to be a top 10 receiver in this league to be worth the 10th overall pick. Tyler Warren to be worth the 7th overall pick, he has to be like one of the 4 best tight ends in the league. And that's a lot to ask. And, if you think I'm making this up about tight ends, you can go back around 2 decades. Brock Bowers' 1,000-yard season last year was only the 4th delivered by a tight end with a top 30 pick. It was the 3rd by a tight end drafted in the top 20. And over the last 2+ decades, last 21 years, there has not been a single tight end drafted in the top 30 who's had multiple 1,000-yard seasons. Now, Brock Bowers has a chance to be the exception. He has a chance to change that this coming season. But it shows you how difficult it is to find an impact tight end. And more than that, it shows you how difficult it is to find that in a tight end you draft high. You look at the great tight ends in the league, the guys who've been standouts. Rob Gronkowski was a day 2 pick. George Kittle was a day 3 pick. Mark Andrews was a day 2 pick. Travis Kelce was a day 2 pick. The league just does not do a great job. Sam Laporta, who's Detroit's excellent tight end. If you're looking for a model, Aaron Glenn obviously comes from the Detroit Lions. So does Tanner Engstrand, the Jets offensive coordinator. Sam Laporta was a guy who was not drafted in the top 10. The great tight ends usually don't go that high. Usually, even if you want a great tight end, they're usually available. The great tight end prospects are usually available on day 2, maybe late day 1, but typically into day 2. So I think it'd be very difficult to justify drafting Tyler Warren in the top 10. And I think this is one of those situations where Brock Bowers leads you to the wrong conclusions. Brock Bowers is such an outlier, and Tyler Warren is just. Brock Bowers dominated college football from the second he set foot on the field, and Tyler Warren did not. I was not a huge fan of the idea of drafting Brock Bowers last year, but I at least understood why a team would want to do it, because the potential was always there for the season he actually had. I don't think Tyler Warren really has that potential. Yeah, he moves around a lot. Yeah, Penn State used him in all sorts of different roles. They flex him out to the outside. They put him in the slot. They lined him up in line. They even, they've used him as their wildcat quarterback. Heck, there was even caught a touchdown pass against USC on a play where he snapped him to the center. He snapped the ball. So yeah, I know they move him around a lot. I think he's got a shot to be a good player, but man, I think it's a lot to ask for him to justify a top 10 overall selection. You look at the other areas the Jets can add. We just talked about Mason Graham, defensive tackle. Defensive tackles dominate and take over the game a lot more than tight ends do. Tight end's really a kind of a low value position. It's not that hard to find a guy who's okay, but for a guy to be able to be a dominant tight end, he's got to be one of the top players at his position, the way a defensive tackle does it. If you want to talk about another guy out there, Will Johnson, a corner from Michigan, a corner can dominate a game way a tight end typically doesn't. They're just better options out there for the Jets. So I think I'd have a big issue with the Jets drafting Tyler Warren in the first round. I think if Tyler Warren were to fall to the second round, I think he'd be a really intriguing selection, but I just think that's way too high. And I'll put it this way: I'm glad Dan Jeremiah's opinion is no longer emblematic of the Jets' thinking, because Joe Douglas was still here. I'd be a little worried hearing that the idea that Tyler Warren was a potential top 10 pick for the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast for us, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll talk again next week.